Hi there, I'm Nathan Canestaro, and first I'd like to offer my thanks to Alex and the World War II Memorial for the invitation to speak today. I'm the author of the Mighty Moo, which is a history of the USS Cowpens. It was published this summer by Hachette. But professionally, I'm a career intelligence official for the U.S. government. I'm currently on assignment to the National Intelligence Council, where I'm Deputy National Intelligence Officer for military issues. But most relevant for this story is I'm the grandson of a Cowpens veteran. And like many people, I became interested in learning more about the war to try and figure out what my grandfather's service in the Navy was like. He served aboard the USS Cowpens as a tail gunner aboard an Avenger torpedo bomber. He was there from 1944 to 1945. But like many of his generation, he really didn't talk about the war. So for me, I started looking into his service and trying to figure out what he was not comfortable telling me. Now, my grandfather's service was pretty typical of the men of his generation. Out of a total U.S. population of 132 million, about 12.5 million Americans served in uniform. So a total percentage of about 10%. But if you drill down and look specifically at men, those numbers get much bigger, much more quickly. So 35% of men aged 30 to 40, plus 45% of men 18 to 29 served in uniform, and another 25% in industry. So many men served in uniform that the odds are that if you had family in the United States in the 1940s, like me, you are probably related to someone who served. These numbers are especially remarkable if you compare them to today, where less than 3% of men and less than 1% of women serve in uniform. So my grandfather never talked much about the war. He was very, very uncomfortable about it. And sadly, when I started digging into it, many of the details of his service have been lost to history. He took them to the grave with him. He was a reservist and an enlisted man, neither of which were really a priority for the Navy's record keeping. So I've been left to sort of piece together what his experience was like on my own. However, in my search for my grandfather's story, I uncovered another story about his ship and the men with whom he served that I think is pretty remarkable. I want to tell you about today. It was a ship that the Navy initially didn't want, with a captain who'd been scapegoated for the loss of his last command, pilots who self-trained on the planes they'd fly into battle. The ship suffered from an early jinx, endured a deadly hurricane, and despite all this, earned a distinguished combat record, 12 battle stars in all, and at war's end were the only U.S. aircraft carrier to witness the final Japanese surrender in Tokyo Bay. And I'm going to walk you through each of those points as the presentation continues. So in order to tell the story of the USS Cowpens, you also have to tell the story of the class of ships to which she belonged. And these were the USS Independence, or the Independence class light aircraft carriers. Now, when you think of a World War II aircraft carrier, you're probably not thinking of the Independence class. You're probably thinking about one of the big fleet carriers, such as the Enterprise or the Essexes, several of which still are museum ships today. But the reality is that the Navy took very, very heavy losses among its flat tops in that first dark year of the war. Of the 6 ships who served, 4 were lost in combat. And the situation was so desperate, with only Saratoga and Enterprise remaining, that the Navy actually asked the British Navy, the Royal Navy, to send them an aircraft carrier for a few months so they could get the Enterprise patched up from her battle wounds. So none of this came as a surprise to President Roosevelt. Even before the war, he was worried about that he didn't have enough flat tops to fight this pending imminent war with Japan. And so he tried to convince the Navy to take some Cleveland-class light cruisers that they had paid for. They were in the construction pipeline, and some of them were already under construction, and wanted to convert them into smaller aircraft carriers that could hold the gap until the big Essexes started arriving in large numbers. And the Navy really didn't much appreciate FDR getting involved in their shipbuilding program. And in fact, when they first said, he first broached the idea to them, they told him no. They told him it was a bad idea. It wouldn't accomplish anything. And he had to go at them a second time and be much more forceful to say no, and we are going to do this. And in that case, the Navy gave him one ship, the first of her class, the Independence. But it wasn't until after Pearl Harbor that they started taking this idea of these light aircraft carriers much more seriously. And in 1942, after each one of these big fleet carriers was lost, they would queue up batches of 2 or 3 of these little CBL standing for Carrier Aircraft Light, the light carriers, to replace them. And in the end, what happened was that these were a desperate stopgap measure. They filled the gap between the war's early casualties and the arrival of the much more capable Essex-class ships. There were 9 in all. Cowpens was the 4th, and they proved to be exactly the right ship at the right time. For at the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the climactic battle that broke the back of Japanese naval aviation in the Second World War, more than half of the Navy's carriers in action that day were these little CBLs. Moving on to the Cowpens specifically. So if you were taking a light cruiser and turning it into a light aircraft carrier, it's not exactly an ideal platform for a flat top. And consequently, the compromises needed to make that work left a lot of traits to be the undesirable traits in these ships. And the first was that they had a dangerously narrow flight deck. It was only 73 feet. Here's a photo of an aft shot of the Cowpens, sort of seen as perhaps an approaching plane would on coming in for a landing. And it really gives you a sense of how narrow this ship really was. Light cruiser hulls were very sleek, and so consequently there's just not much width to them. So 73 feet wide. The Hellcat fighters that were the primary fighter aircraft for the Cowpens had a 42-foot wingspan. The Avenger torpedo bombers had a 54-foot wingspan, and the Island was 6 feet wide. So we're just talking a few feet in either wingtip to come in. And so difficult were the landings that one experienced pilot likened it to hitting a splinter with a bolt of lightning. Consequently, these ships had an extremely high accident rate, much higher than any other carrier type in the fleet. They were dangerous to fly from. Another undesirable trait that came from making carriers out of light cruisers was they had a very high center of gravity. The light cruiser hull was never designed to have that much weight, a flight deck, planes, island, and all that it entails so far off the water. And that raised their center of gravity fairly high. And so consequently, these ships were kind of tippy in that they were prone to roll in very, very high seas. And this becomes an important part of our story a little later on. The other thing you can see from this photo with the Cowpens, she's got a built-in 4 to 6 degree list. All of the Independence class, because they have this island, the sort of the command center for flight operations and the flight deck. You can see it hanging off the side of the ship here on the left, and you're at the photo. That's uncompensated weight. Even with several hundred tons of concrete poured on the opposite side of the ship to try and compensate, they are always leaning a little bit to starboard. The sailors sort of adopted this quirk as their own, and there was a cartoon in the Cowpens newspaper about 2 sailors walking down the street on Liberty with their dates in Pearl Harbor, and both of them had a compensating list to port. And the caption said something the confused dates were saying to each other. Well, he says his ship has a starboard list. 2 other points that sort of made these carriers a very difficult place to live and fly from. One, that they were crowded. The Cleveland-class hull was designed to host 1,300 people. The Independence class had more than 1,500 aboard. Essentially, the extra 200 plus were the pilots, the mechanics, the people you need to fly planes and keep them operating. And there weren't much room for planes. There were only 33 aboard at any given time, compared to just a little under 100 for the Essexes. And usually that worked out to be 24 Hellcats, 9 Avenger torpedo bombers. But the 2 things that these ships had going for them, and why the Navy eventually latched onto them after some reluctance, was that they were fast. First, they had a light cruiser hull. They had the same power plants and screws as the Cleveland class. They could do better than 31 knots. They're also relatively quick to build in comparison to the Essexes, especially since some of the construction on these ships had started before the war as light cruisers, and essentially they just had to retrofit a partially existing hull already. Let me introduce you next to the Cowpens' first commanding officer, Commander Robert P. McConnell, who known as Captain Mac to his crew. He was a Mustang, which was a rarity in the sort of the pre-war era. He started his career as an enlisted man shortly after World War One. Got a commission, became an officer, and worked his way up through the ranks. This meant that he did not have a Naval Academy degree, and during the sort of the interwar period, the Navy became very inward-looking and sort of parochial and fussy about pedigree. So the fact that he was not an academy man meant that he was an outsider in the Navy's old boy network. His first command was the USS Langley, which started life as the Navy's first aircraft carrier. But by the time McConnell got her, she was a seaplane tender. They chopped off the first 40% of her flight deck so they could pull the big Catalinas aboard to do repair work. He was sent on a frankly pointless and borderline suicidal mission to deliver P-40 warplanes to Java on the eve of the Japanese capture of that island. It wouldn't have made any difference even if he got there, and micromanagement by his commanding officer meant that he steamed the last 100 miles to port in broad daylight, which meant that the Japanese found him, attacked his ship, and mortally wounded it. So Langley was afire on the brink of capsizing. They evacuated his crew to the escorting destroyers. They tried to sink it with a couple of torpedoes. That didn't work. And McConnell was concerned that essentially the Japanese would turn any minute and wipe out the rest of his little ships. So he left without seeing Langley sink, which was something that he would get no end of grief for shortly. He and his crew were evacuated from the area aboard an oiler, the Pecos, which in turn was also sunk by the Japanese 4 days later. So this poor guy, Captain Mack, and his crew, all those aboard the Langley, went into the water twice in 4 days. And when it was all done and they finally made it back to Australia, a third of McConnell's crew was lost. And it was something that his daughter said deeply affected him. He was never the same after that. Not only that, his commanding officer, whose micromanagement had actually contributed to the failure of the mission, tried blaming him for abandoning Langley prematurely. And it took intercession by Admiral King, the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet, to essentially save his career and expunge his record. One thing to mention about the Cowpens and the CVLs generally is this was not a first-string assignment. If you were a Naval Academy grad, if you were the Navy's elite, you're going to end up on one of the big carriers if you are, if you are assigned to naval aviation. And as a result, Cowpens and her sisters were predominantly stacked with officers who were kind of second tier or reservists, folks whose career wouldn't continue in the Navy after the war was over. So the vast bulk of the crew, 1,300 men or more were reservists, fresh out of boot camp, 17 to 18 years old. More than 70% of the crew who was aboard had absolutely no seagoing experience at all. And I've talked to some of these men, recently now, in their early and mid 90s. I asked them why they joined the Navy, and the answer was almost always the same. They volunteered for the Navy so they wouldn't get enlisted in the Army. They didn't want to be in the infantry. And it didn't mean they didn't believe in the cause or, they didn't want to serve. But their fathers and their uncles had served in the First World War, and they knew what that life was like. And they liked the idea that if you went to the Navy, you could pick your assignment. The Navy encouraged people to do this because they wanted the recruits at the expense of the Army. And the idea that you could take your cots and your chow with you wherever you went, I think was appealing to a lot of these kids. So the pilots were a little older. The rules at the time said 21 to 23 years old, 2 to 4 years of college. So old men by the comparison of the crew. But by and large, there were very few people, academy grads aboard, or old men above the age of 30, mostly just Captain McConnell and his senior crew. Probably less than a dozen academy grads aboard this ship of more than 1,500 people. To sort of give you a sense of like how improvised some of its staffing were on board these ships, the Cowpens chief engineer, the man most responsible for operating its machinery, necessary to make it go places and do things, he was a thermodynamics professor from Penn State with absolutely no practical experience operating ship's machinery at all. He had several months to sort of grow into the role with one of the few academy grads aboard with an engineering degree to sort of help him along the way. The deck was seemingly stacked against the Cowpens as she got started with an inexperienced crew. Adding to that was the Cowpens jinx, a series of unfortunate accidents in the second half of 1943 that led many of the crew to wonder what exactly they'd gotten themselves into. The first time the jinx struck was on the shakedown cruise in Chesapeake Bay. The air group made its first landings aboard, and they completely bungled it. There were several crashes. One man in his aircraft went over the side and into the drink. He was the inaugural member of the ship's Donkey Club, which is a dubious honor to be sure. And then returning to Norfolk for reprovisioning, the ship became tangled in a anti-submarine net, and that was due to some bungling on the part of the bridge crew. They're all inexperienced. They made a series of compounding errors that basically they'd missed the entrance, and the screws got tangled on the net. They were stranded in the net for more than 3 days. Captain McConnell was responsible for all the actions of his crew and received an official admonishment for letting his ship become entangled. And that was the last thing he needed after his very close call with dereliction of duty the year before. Moving on, you get out to the Pacific. They go on their first combat mission at Wake Island. It was a bit of a training mission. It wasn't that hard to target in the Navy's estimation, and the operation was billed as a dress rehearsal for the big operations that were followed later on. That being said, it didn't go well for the Cowpens. 4 fighter pilots were killed, 2 in combat, 2 just disappeared. We have no idea what happened to them. They may have collided in midair. 2 more were shot down and recovered by submarine. And really what this was the result of was a mix of the pilots' overconfidence and inexperience. And they were taking a lot of risks, making multiple low-level strafing passes on enemy targets, risks that in a few months they would never think of doing. But they were just a little too overeager, and it caught up with them on this mission. So they returned to Pearl Harbor to sort of lick their wounds and absorb what these casualties mean for them and their tactics. And it hurt. It was a tight knit group of folks. They called themselves the Squad. They were a band of brothers in every sense of the word. They're good friends. And so these were really stinging losses. And Captain McConnell used the opportunity to give his crew a little bit more experience and do some nighttime takeoffs and landings and get them night qualified. And during one of these operations, one of the escorting destroyers, the Abbott, collided with the Moo, actually sliced into her side. The photo here shows you what the damage is like in dry dock. No one, thankfully, was killed aboard the Moo. 6 men were crushed to death in their bunks aboard the Abbott. And the Moo went back to 9 days of repair and dry dock. And while there, someone aboard, and I don't know if it was ship's crew or civilian repair staff, tried to dump water from one of the ship's tanks into the dry dock, ended up dumping aviation fuel instead, and sparks from welders above set off the gasoline and led to a fire and explosion. So here it is. It's one turn of bad events after another, and the crew is beginning to talk. What is this ship? Is a jinx. It's a bad luck. It's a bad luck ship. But thankfully, that was where it ended. And in the coming months, the Cowpens really gelled into a dependable workhorse for the Navy's task force of fast carriers. Captain McConnell had a heck of a job in front of him in turning this green mob of men into a combat-ready team. But over time, he succeeded in doing so. And a lot of it was honestly just on-the-job training and repetition. There was a long string of operations, and each one, these guys just got a little better and a little better and a little more experienced. We talked about Wake, operations in the Gilbert, Marshalls, Truk, Marianas, and several others. And in particular, the February 1944 raid on Truk, Operation Hailstone, was a real confidence builder for the Moo. Truk had a very ominous reputation as sort of this unassailable fortress of Japanese power in the Central Pacific. They called it the Gibraltar of the Pacific. All these terrible rumors about how it's defended by an elite legion of fighter pilots and no one ever returns and blah, blah, blah. And it was intimidating for the crew, and then the mission went very well with no casualties for them. So for that was a real confidence builder for them that they could take on enemy strongholds like this and come out the other side. Flash forwarding into the summer of 1944, June 1944, is the operations, the invasions of the Marianas. And by this point, many of the experienced fighter squadrons in the Navy's fleet of fast carrier task force had completed their tour of duty. They'd rotated home, leaving behind only a handful who had been at the earlier raid on the Marianas that spring. This essentially meant that Cowpens Air Group 25 was one of the few remaining veteran squadrons present for the Battle of the Philippine Sea that June in 1944. They did very well, 20 aerial victories over the course of a month, but it came at a very, very high cost. And overall, by the time they completed their combat deployment at the end of June, with the Battle of the Philippine Sea behind them, 40% of the original pilots who joined the ship in Philadelphia in the summer of 1943 had been killed. They'd been replaced by others, and even those had taken casualties. So this is a very, very heavy loss for a relatively small squadron. I want to talk in particular about one loss. I want to introduce you to Lieutenant Commander Bob Price. Bob was one of what historians would call the first team of Navy fighter pilots. He flew in VF-3 before the war with both Jimmy Thatch and Butch O'Hare. He was not an Academy grad. He graduated the University of Illinois. And eventually he was transferred to the Moo. He started his career there first as the commander of the ship's first fighter squadron. Then he was promoted to be commander of its air group. And he was beloved by his men, very charismatic, earnest, honest, just a good guy all around. Everyone loved him. And in June 1944, during operations in the Marianas, they were attacking a Japanese convoy off Pagan. He was shot down. He was seen alive and unhurt in the water, so he was okay. He'd made a perfect water landing. And it was shortly before dusk, so his colleagues threw him a note and said, "Hang in there. We'll be back in the morning with a rescue plane to pick you up." The rescue launches on time the next morning. They arrive at the site where they expect Bob to be. He's nowhere to be found. They return to base after exhausting all their fuel looking for him. They request permission for another rescue mission. Their admiral, a guy by the name of Keen Harrell, reassigns it to another mission, to another squadron from another carrier. These guys search in the wrong place. They don't account for his drift. And so Cowpens goes back to Admiral Harrell and says, "Hey, they searched in the wrong place. We want a third mission." And Admiral Harrell or his staff denies permission, essentially leaving Bob to the mercy of the sea. It was a huge loss for the squadron. As I mentioned, he's really a beloved figure, highly respected. About 9-10 days later, one of Bob Price's friends, a guy by the name of Tex McCrary, serving aboard another carrier, the Hornet, has this dream. And the dream is that Bob is alive, he's floating in the Pacific, and he's just waiting for somebody to pick him up. And the dream was so vivid that McCrary was convinced it was real. But he thought that people would think him crazy if he told them that. And eventually he worked up the courage, and he told his commanding officer, an admiral by the name of Jocko Clark. He told him about the dream. And much to his surprise, Jocko didn't think him nuts and said, "Well, we got to do something about this." So the two men sat down with maps, and they did calculations of wind and current. And the best they could tell, after that many days adrift, Bob was probably about 100 miles out of their way. And so Jocko approved the detour. And sure enough, right where they expected him to be, they find Bob Price floating alive and unhurt on his survival raft after 11 days at sea. He was badly dehydrated and 30 pounds lighter than he started, but he was still basically in one piece. They winched him aboard Hornet. Admiral Clark pinned a Purple Heart on him on the spot and posted two photos here. One, a photo of the headlines, which talks about how the Jocko Clark's task group went out of its way to find Bob, but also the photo that was taken moments after his recovery as he's being winched aboard Hornet and right before he got his Purple Heart. Carrier squadrons on these have a set lifespan aboard a carrier. They're usually only there 6 or 8 months. And by the summer of 1944, Air Group 25 had done its bit. It was exhausted and fatigued, and it was sent home to be reformed. In its place came an Air Group 22, my grandfather's air group. Now, they had already served aboard the USS Independence, but that ship had been torpedoed off Tarawa, and so they had been reformed in California and had been sent out to the Cowpens after Independence had turned into a night carrier. So Air Group 22 had a pretty rough tour of duty aboard the Cowpens. The fall of 1944, the ship took more casualties than at any other point during its wartime career. And part of this problem was that the logistical bases that were supporting the carrier operations were moved closer to the fighting. Essentially, they're operating in the Carolines and Ulithi and Majuro and places like that. So there's a lot less time in transit and a lot more time in combat. In addition to that, the Air Group 22 didn't necessarily get along with its captain, Captain Herbert Taylor, nor did they necessarily get along with each other. So it was a pretty turbulent period for the ship and its fighter pilots, but certainly momentous in terms of the amount of combat they saw. And much of their time was spent supporting operations in General MacArthur's operations in the Philippines, both prepping for the invasions at Leyte and then supporting them, mostly by hitting airfields up and down the Philippine coast and thinning out the number of aircraft that potentially could interfere with the landing forces. I want to highlight one incident in particular. On October 13th and 14th, October 1944, the Navy's Task Force of Fast Carriers was off Formosa, which is now Taiwan. And essentially what happened was 2 of Cowpens' escorts were torpedoed on subsequent nights. On the 13th, Japanese planes came in fast and low under radar coverage. Torpedo bombers dropped their torpedoes. One torpedo barely misses the Cowpens, passes right behind her, and strikes Canberra, one of her escorts who was steaming just to the port and behind the Cowpens, as sort of the inner ring of protective ships. The following night, same thing happens. Enemy planes coming fast and low, under radar cover, basically from the same direction. They drop their torpedoes. One passes immediately to the aft of Cowpens, just like it did the night before, and strikes the Houston, who had just taken Canberra's place in the formation mere hours before. So you've got these two ships. They're badly wounded, on the verge of sinking. Normally, the Navy's first instincts would be what they call scuttle and skedaddle. Evacuate the crew, scuttle the ship. You don't want to, as the saying goes, throw good ships after bad, lose more ships defending these two mortally wounded ones that may never return to service. However, Admiral Halsey's staff convinces him to do the opposite, to use them as bait. And so much of the fleet withdraws, and Halsey leaves Cowpens and Cabot to cover the retreat of these two wounded ships. They're under tow. They're not moving very fast, only a few knots, and it's more than 1,000 miles to the nearest repair port. So Cabot and Cowpens both have a field day over the course of the next couple of days with waves of incoming fighters. They both have a number of high kill engagements. Cowpens bags 8 on the 15th and 9 more on the 16th. So it sort of gives you the sense that the Japanese are throwing everything they've got in terms of aircraft at these two wounded ships. They're partially successful. Houston takes another torpedo. Both make it back to port and are eventually repaired and returned to service. So I've talked to a lot of Cowpens veterans now, as I mentioned, sort of in their early to mid 90s, and as well as my own grandfather. And when you ask them the question, when were you most scared? The answer is always the same thing. It wasn't with enemy action. It was with Typhoon Cobra. And that was on December 18th, 1944. Halsey's Third Fleet sailed right into the teeth of this typhoon. Meteorological forecasting isn't what it is today with satellite imagery. They didn't really know where the storm was, how close it was, what direction it was approaching, and sailed right into the teeth of it. And it caught them completely by surprise. And this was a vicious, violent storm. Raging seas, winds of 100 to 120 knots, waves in excess of between 70 and 100 feet tall at times. The Cowpens is just battered by waves. As I mentioned earlier, these ships are pretty top heavy to begin with, and you're being pounded by these wind and waves. So she is rolling more than 45 degrees to either side. The ship's captain, Captain George DeBaun, said that there was a roll meter on the bridge, and it went from 45 degrees one way to 45 degrees the other. There was a needle at both sides of the sort of the dial where it stopped. And the ship was rolling so much that as it went from port to starboard, the needle would swing over and hit the needle at 45 degrees and bounce a few times. And then it would roll back to the other side and then bounce on that needle. And this went on for hours on end. DeBaun estimated the ship may have rolled in close to 50 degrees, which was approaching her threshold for capsizing. It was so bad that the edge of the flight deck was dipping into the ocean. The flight deck, by the way, is about 70 feet above the water in calm seas. Men on the bridge could reach out and touch green water. The photo here of the ship rolling, you can see her side-mounted exhaust stacks, and that she said the ship's official report of the storm said she was shipping water down her exhaust stacks, and commented that when an aircraft carrier is taking water down her exhaust stacks, God is near everyone on that vessel. So one close call that bears particular mention is that the magazine was absolutely filled to overflowing with bombs. The ship had been stocked up in anticipation of doing close air support for General MacArthur and Leyte, and it had more bombs in the hold than they had racks to store them. And as the ship was rolling back and forth, not only did the additional bombs break loose, but several broke loose from their racks. And the ship's history of the storm said that the 500-pound bombs were bouncing around like tennis balls on the floor of the magazine, and the 2,000-pound bombs were slamming into the bulkhead with such force that Captain DeBaun up on the bridge, 7 decks up, could feel the impact with each time they slammed in. So the ship's crew rushes in to try and lasso these bombs and get them under control. And they said that they would only have a few precious moments to do so, where the ship was more or less on an even keel. And then they'd lasso them with a rope and try and get them lashed down. But then as it started going to one side or the other, the crew, in order to avoid being crushed by the bombs, would leap up and grab the rafters overhead and pull themselves up to avoid getting hit. The reports for the day described it as shades of Tarzan. The risk to the Cowpens is, I think, best exemplified by the fact that 3 destroyers in the fleet that day capsized and sank, killing almost 800 men. Cowpens was very much on the brink of following, pulled through only by the narrowest of margins with only 1 man lost. That is perhaps good news that the losses could have been far worse. There were a lot of number of injuries, men being thrown about. However, that the one loss was still tragic in that the man swept overboard was Bob Price, the lieutenant commander who spent 11 days adrift on a life raft in June. He had gone up onto the flight deck with a crew of volunteers. One of the ship's Hellcat fighters had caught fire, had broken loose from his moorings, slid across the deck into the catwalk and caught fire. And the fire had threatened to spread to several other aircraft, which had been fueled for, in anticipation that they might have to fly immediately after the storm. And these men put themselves at great risk to cut this plane free and get it over the side. But in so doing, Bob lost his life, was swept overboard, and was never recovered. I also want to introduce you to another pilot, and this is Lieutenant Clem Craig. He was Cowpens' greatest fighter ace, and he finished the war with 12.5 aerial kills and 2 Navy crosses. Now, Clem was a pretty stern guy. He was devoted to duty. He didn't have much of a sense of humor or much tolerance, honestly, for those who didn't take his duties as seriously as he did. So sometimes pretty difficult to get along with. Even his own father joked that his middle initial of M stood for morbid. But Clem was a tremendous pilot. He was a deadly shot with his Hellcats 50 caliber machine guns, and did very well as a combat leader. One instance in the fall of 1944, he shot down 4 enemy aircraft in a single engagement, but that was not his greatest engagement of the war, and I want to talk to you a little bit about that. So on January 21st, 1945, Clem and 7 other Cowpens Hellcats were sent to investigate several bogies on the ship's radar, which were approaching the Moo, and they were vectored in to intercept these planes. And what looked like 4 planes on radar turned out to be 18. I joked it's a bit like that final scene from the original Top Gun with Goose and Maverick showing up, and there's a lot more MiGs than they anticipated. Well, that actually happened in this case. And in Clem's estimation, he wasn't daunted by the odds at all. And he joked afterwards that he said, well, 8 Hellcats versus 18 enemy aircraft is about even odds. I think he was a little conservative in that estimation, because the dogfight lasted less than 5 minutes, and Clem and his colleagues shot down all but 1. Clem was responsible for 5 of those, making him one of the elite few Navy pilots that could claim ace-in-a-day status. Now, this shooting is even more remarkable if you take a look at the number of rounds that he had at his disposal. The Hellcat fighters only have 400 rounds per 50 caliber machine gun, which translates to about 6 seconds of firing. So here Clem is. He's in this swirling dogfight with fighters everywhere, everyone trying to get the drop on someone else, and he shoots down 5 enemy planes on average with about 6 seconds of fire each. That's pretty good shooting by any standard. So we're getting into the spring of 1945. The Cowpens is pretty war-weary. She's developing a lot of mechanical problems for all the hard steaming that she's been doing in the past year, 15 months. And so she's sent home for an overhaul in the spring of 1945. She misses Okinawa, but she's back with the fleet by the summer of 45 for the final round of airstrikes against the Japanese Empire. So Admiral Halsey and the fast carriers are moving up and down the Japanese coast. They're essentially hitting anything they can to bring the cost of the war home to the enemy. And by August comes around, and everyone aboard is completely surprised by the announcement that the atom bomb has been dropped. They have no idea that this was coming. Honestly, they have really no idea even what it is. The dropping of the bombs, though, presents Admiral Halsey with a bit of a dilemma. He knows that he has to send one of his carriers into Tokyo Bay to be part of the occupation force. At the same time, however, we know he doesn't trust the Japanese. This was a generation that was deeply scarred by the betrayal at Pearl Harbor, and Halsey was like many in the United States Navy at the time who thought it was a trap. That the Japanese really didn't mean they wanted to surrender, and that they would get the Americans into the confined waters of Tokyo Bay and then swarm them with kamikazes and kill as many as possible, and the war would be back on. So while he had his duty that he needed to send a carrier in, he also wanted to protect his big, irreplaceable fleet carriers. He found the compromise that would allow him to do both, by designating the Cowpens to be the only U.S. aircraft carrier to go into Tokyo Bay. To say everyone aboard the Cowpens was shocked by this turn of events is an understatement. Some aboard were speculating that it was because Admiral Halsey, his daughter, had actually sponsored the ship. She had commissioned it and broke the bottle of champagne on her bow. But the reality was much more pragmatic. Cowpens, it's sort of this irony that Cowpens achieved the greatest honor of her wartime career because she was expendable. That if she had been lost, it would not be such a big deal for the Navy. And that perhaps was not also lost on some of the men aboard. One of who's commented, he said, I'd rather occupy a den of porcupines. So we know now, again, with the benefit of history, when the Japanese agreed to surrender, they meant it. That her time in Tokyo Bay was uneventful, and she was close enough to witness the Japanese surrender, at least through binoculars. She was in port at the time when it happens. This photo that I presented here on the slide, this is a photo that was taken at the exact moment at the end of the war. It was mere moments after the announcement had reached the Cowpens that to cease military operations against the Empire of Japan. There's also a photo from the ship's newspaper that shows a victorious Mighty Moo celebrating with the Allies on the deck of their little flat top. So, in closing, Cowpens' career was as momentous as it was brief. In only 26 months of wartime service, 211,615 miles steamed, more than 11,000 carrier landings, 93 enemy planes destroyed in the air, 512 on the ground, 60 men lost. And at the end, the Navy decided it no longer needed the little CBLs. You have to remember that they were just this wartime expedient meant to fill the gap between the Navy's early losses and when the Essexes would start arriving. And now at the end of the war, the Navy had as many Essexes as it needed, plus it was starting to get the new big Midway-class armored battle carriers. So it really had no need for these little CBLs. Cowpens was put into mothballs almost immediately after the end of the war, early 1946. She was never reactivated and scrapped in 1960. And none of her sisters survive today. Well, many of the big carriers are now museum ships, and there's lots of relics around to go and see and put your hands on. There's very little that historians can go and see that is connected to a CBL. Two of the CBLs went and served in foreign navies. Belleau Wood went to the French and then returned and was mothballed and scrapped. Cabot went to the Spanish Navy as Dedalo. She returned to the United States in the 80s and was scrapped in 1989. Two former presidents, George H.W. Bush and Gerald Ford, both of whom had served on CBLs during the war, tried to preserve her as a museum ship, but sadly they could not. They could not generate the money. And there's only one surviving example of the Cleveland-class light cruisers on which they're based. That's in Buffalo, New York. So you can only see one of those. I'll point out perhaps the best place to go to see maybe a little bit of what it was like is the Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida. They have got a replica of the Cabot's Island. You can see it in the photo there, as well as the outline of the CBL's deck on the interior of their museum space. And there's a few other places that have individual items, but really not much is left to honor the CBLs for what they did. However, that's not to say that others haven't been honoring the CBL service in their own ways. So starting in the 1970s, the World War II veterans of the Cowpens decided the time had come for a reunion. And they started gathering in the ship's namesake town of Cowpens, South Carolina, which if you've never been there is a tiny little town in upstate South Carolina. It's about 1,500 people right outside of Spartanburg. They have gathered almost every Father's Day since. They skipped 1980 just as things were sort of getting started. And then again in 2020 because of the COVID pandemic. But what started as just merely a reunion of servicemen is blossomed into this, what they call the Mighty Moo Festival. And it's a classic small town Moo Festival, or small town festival. And the town really rolls out the red carpet for them. It's an emotional event for everyone. The town takes it very seriously. They view themselves as the symbolic home port of the USS Cowpens. Now, over time, what started as several hundred World War II attendees who attended every single Father's Day is down to one. And I'll introduce you to him. His name's Ray Williams. He's the third from the left in that photo below. He just turned 100 years old this summer, just in time for the festival this year. However, starting in 1991, the World War II veterans have been joined by a new generation of Cowpens sailors. the USS Cowpens CG-63, which is a Ticonderoga-class guided missile cruiser, joined the fleet in 91. She did a full career and was sadly just decommissioned in August of 2024. And the community is lobbying for a third Moo to carry on the Cowpens name well into the 21st century. So with that, I just want to close by saying thank you for the opportunity to discuss the Cowpens. The Cowpens and the CVLs writ large are a largely overlooked aspect of the war. And like the town, I just feel an obligation to share the story to honor the veterans who served aboard, not only my grandfather, but all his shipmates, and particularly the 60 men who never came home, who were lost in battle along the way. I'm hopeful, like the town of Cowpens, that someday soon there will be a new Mighty Moo who will carry on this legacy of service well into the 21st century for the U.S. Navy. And with that, I'd be happy to entertain your questions.
Hi there, Nathan. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
It's our pleasure. What a great story. We have a limited amount of time and we have a lot of questions, which is testament to how great your presentation was. So I'm going to fire through these and then ask you a couple of broader questions about the war in the Pacific. First of all, a comment from Clara. Love this underdog story. Who doesn't? Tells you so much about the perseverance and integrity of the greatest generation. I'm going to add to that. What drew you to this story apart from your grandfather? What was it about it that resonated with you personally, apart from your grandfather?
I think part of it was that it's an underdog story, and actually it was the original working title of the book. This little ship that I'd never heard of, and I figured, thought myself pretty well informed on history, could have this important role and could sort of fill this moment in Tokyo Bay, and no one had ever heard of her. And then you add to that the Typhoon, which is just an amazing story by itself. And then Bob Price. I mean, there's so much going on here, just one turn of events after the other, and it's just been overlooked. I mean, that's just that as a historian, that's a once in a lifetime find.
Briefly, I heard you mention two presidents, Ford and Bush.
Yes.
Let's talk about that a little bit, because I believe that those two individuals gave more than any other president who served in World War II. And people don't know a lot about Ford. We've had books and a lot of accounts of Bush's incredible service, but Ford people tend to forget about. Can you remind our audience just how amazing his service was in World War II?
Sure. So I believe Ford turned down an offer to play in the NFL to join the Navy, and he was aboard the Monterey, another CVL, who was present at Typhoon Cobra, the same storm, and he talked about it at length in his autobiography. He had a very close call with death, where essentially he was going up to the bridge, because there was a fire aboard, and he was sort of going to his battle station. He was an ensign at the time. And in order to go from his compartment to the bridge, you had to go outside and on the flight deck. And he comes out the hatch and the ship lurches. And apparently he slid the full width of the flight deck. And it was only because of what they call deck combing, which is a little piece of metal about an inch high around the deck they used to keep the tools from rolling off, that he grabbed onto this. So he very nearly went over the side. But I think for Ford, what really sort of gripped me later in his life, when he took over from President Nixon after Nixon resigned, he actually used this storm, Typhoon Cobra, as sort of a metaphor for the ship of state. It was the country was in the middle of a tremendous storm, and the government was this little ship that was being tossed about by forces beyond its control, and it was his job just to get them through. So clearly that storm really made an impression on him.
So here's a statistic that was really amazing for me. When you say that 45% of American men between the ages of 18 and 29 served in uniform, that's quite something. And I would add to that what would happen to the political discourse in this country if almost 50% of American males had actually served a cause greater than themselves?
I think the ripple effects of that were huge. You take a look at the people who served in Congress and in public office for decades after the war, and the vast bulk of them were veterans, regardless of political stripe. So I think that shaped the American political consciousness in those early days of the Cold War. Yeah, huge impacts. And, there's a lot of people in the country today, I think it's bipartisan to say that, there should be a requirement for public service, get more people involved.
Imagine if it was more than 50% of young male and female Americans who actually had to take maybe a year to do something to give back to their country. How would that would fundamentally transform this country, wouldn't it?
I think so. You could also liken it to some of the New Deal measures that Roosevelt did before the war, the Civilian Conservation Corps, and there's still huge numbers of public works that can stretch even like non-military service. Their lineage goes back to these periods when Americans were very much involved in serving their country.
So we have a question. Given the list of the ship, how did she handle in rough seas? Given your research, was this a ship you would have enjoyed being part of the crew? That's one question. I want to ask you, how bloody difficult was it to fly from this ship? I'm thinking this, you had to be one hell of a pilot in bad weather to be able to even survive more than a month or two.
There was an interview with one of the Avenger pilots, the bigger aircraft, 54 feet wingspan. And he said after a carrier tour duty, there was more than a few new gray hairs aboard the pilots. But they also sort of took a pride in having the skill to do this and do this well. And there was a story about, I'm not sure it was a Cowpens pilot, but it was a CVL pilot. And he was directed to do, abort to a larger Essex class and make a landing. And the pilot said, sure, which runway?
Take us through how you would land after combat on this ship.
Sure. So the one of the unfortunate quirks about the ship is it did not have a side-mounted elevator. The elevators that go from the flight deck down to the hangar deck were in the middle of the flight deck. So you could not both launch or land aircraft and move them. So if you're coming in on a landing, essentially there is a crash barrier that is halfway down the deck. If you don't wave off early and you don't grab a wire, you're going into the crash barrier. So, and unfortunately, if you come down really hard, you might actually bounce over the crash barrier and plow into some of the planes parked forward. The other thing in terms of danger, the Hellcats had a big radial engine, and when you jam the throttle forward, it generates a lot of torque. It'll pull you sort of to port. So you've got the fighter, the landing signals officer, and he's sort of telling you too high, too low, too fast. And at some point, he may signal wave off. And there was a real skill to it because you want enough power to actually be able to pull away and not crash, but not too much power. Like if you absolutely jam it, your plane might invert and you might roll over and then you'd hit the water upside down. And that did not necessarily give you good odds for survival. So it's funny. I talked to a crewman of the ship, a guy by the name of John Ingraham, and he came aboard as an 18-year-old and he saw all incredibly dangerous this was. And he said, I felt bad for these pilots. And then he said, I got to know a few of them. I started talking to them. The reality was they're having a ball. They thought this was the greatest thing ever. Fighter pilots are a self-competent bunch. These guys were entirely volunteers. And many of them signed up because flying fighters was the hottest thing. And they wanted to fly the hottest thing. And the risk was acceptable.
That kind of answers a question from Clara. Were you able to interview any of the men who served on the Mighty Moo? Can you tell us a little bit about some of these guys?
Sure. So perhaps my one regret is I started this book 10 years too late. But even still, I interviewed probably about 15, variety of different roles. Wow. There was one, I did not talk to Clem Craig, but his son did a very good biography based on all his diaries. Bob Price left all his letters home to his wife. They're in the Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola. But I talked to a man by the name of Ed Haley. And Ed was a replacement pilot, arrived aboard in the fall of 43. And I had the chance to interview him on the phone. And was a sort of a very introspective, thoughtful guy. And his primary problem was he was a little short to be a fighter pilot. And his first landing aboard, as you're coming in, he was not tall enough to seat, so he couldn't see over the nose, and he lost sight of the LSO, and essentially put his plane into the catwalk, and they pushed it overboard. And he was despondent. It's like he hadn't even been in combat; he'd already lost a plane. So the LSO takes him aside and says, "Hey, I've seen this before. So what I want you to do is, on landing, I want you to stick your head out of the side of the aircraft as you're coming in, because you have to have the cockpit open because there's no ejection seat, and that's the only way you're getting out." So he tried that on his next landing. That worked out great for him, but he was sort of subject to all kinds of abuse from his squadron mates, because they called him the railroad engineer, because he's hanging, you can see his head hanging at the side of his aircraft as he's coming in. I found Ed because he went aboard the Patriot Point, the carrier Patriot Point, I forget if it's Lexington or Yorktown, and he climbed into a Hellcat fighter at like 95 for the first time in 75 years. And it was great to see him. They helped him up. He was in frail health, helped him up and got him in the cockpit. And he was instantly at home. While his hands went to the controls, like he was flipping switches and getting everything going. And one of his family members cheered, "He's going to take off." So he was a real lively guy, even when I met him in his 90s.
We have a comment here that I'm going to read out slowly because it's of some import to me as a Limey. Great story, and the link to Cowpens, where the colonials were beaten by the British, yet decimated the redcoats in the struggle. This is one of the reasons why I never wear red. This is burgundy, but it's not red, okay? It's not red. Inspiring to learn about a great story that was inspired by family history, and that's from one of our great viewers. Another question here, or statement regarding Ford. Despite being lampooned as clumsy on Saturday Night Live, he was one of the most athletic presidents. I wanted to ask you a little bit about Halsey. This is a name that not enough people revere. Tell us a little bit about Admiral Halsey.
So Halsey, I guess we're asking related to the Cowpens specifically, or just sort of broader in terms of his role?
Broadly.
So Halsey was a hard charger. There were two teams essentially of the admirals that were running the task force of fast carriers. You had Spruance and Mitcher in one, and then Halsey in the other, and the name would rotate back and forth between the two. I think perhaps the best way to explain him would be to sort of compare the two. Halsey was the analyst, the deep thinker, the cerebral, very kind of methodical and careful. And Halsey was sort of the bull in the china shop. He would just go at the enemy, throw everything he had at him, no subtlety, maybe sort of Patton-like in that sense. He had kind of a mixed reputation aboard the Moo, in that, particularly at the end of the war, that many of the pilots thought that they were taking, particularly after the atomic bombing, thought they were taking unnecessary risks for very little losses, so Halsey could get headlines. And Halsey was really good with the press. He was a national hero at home, and also he was nearly court-martialed on two occasions for steaming his fleet into the Typhoon, first with Cobra, and then the second Typhoon, I believe, in May. And there was certainly something to those allegations, but by and large, he was let skate. He sort of skated on that because he was a national hero at home. Although John McCain, Senator McCain's father, took the hit for Halsey the second time around and was sent home to be chief of the VA and died before he got there. So, perhaps there's Halsey Halsey lovers and Halsey haters. I'm perhaps not a Halsey fan. I think Spruance should have gotten his 5 stars as opposed to Halsey. Maybe that's a minority opinion, but if nothing else, he's an incredibly colorful character. As a historian, you just can't make somebody like that up. There's plenty of great anecdotes about him that are super lively.
Well, for every Bradley, we need a Patton, Yeah. Unfortunately, we had those pairings often in the European theatre and in the Pacific, thank goodness. I just want to say, Nathan, what an awesome presentation. We've had several comments. Thank you for your time this week and today. I wish you all the very best, and you're exactly the kind of presenter that we love having, because it's such a wonderful deep dive into stories that we haven't had the privilege of knowing about. So I wish you a great weekend. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for having me. Thank you, everyone.